Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our December Farm Talk breakfast. We have this program once a month on the third Friday of the month at 8:30 in the morning. Recently, we have adapted the program to be virtual, so we do apologize that we don't have breakfast available for you to eat, but we hope sometime in the near future we'll be able to return to that format. Instead, we're here on Zoom with our special guest for today, Chris Penrose. Chris is one of my mentors, and he works in the neighboring county. He is in Morgan County, and he has years of experience both managing beef cattle and doing extension programming. Chris's topic for today is winter supplementation for beef cattle. Chris, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christine. Pleasure to be here today. Glad to get to do another one of these for you. Um, for those of you that have ever done a live Zoom presentation, Christine, the first one that I did with you, I went back and listened to it, and I was very, very disappointed with the quality of work I did. That was probably one of the first programs I ever did, and I can't believe how many times I said, So I'm going to work my best not to do that too much today. So I am going to talk about winter supplementation of beef cows. And oh, I just said that. If anybody does have questions as we go, please let me know. I'll be happy to try to address any of those. I really love to get to talk to my friends over in Noble County. I've got a lifelong relationships with people over there. One of my favorite comments that I heard when I first started going to school back in the early 80s. I actually went to Washington State Community College, got a degree in agriculture, and we had some classes over at the Eastern Ag Research Station or at the Regional Extension Office. And Lauren Sanford, Dave Miller were some of my teachers there. And Lauren told us early on, it's the eye of the master that fattens the cows. So as we work on this stuff, as we look at winter supplementation, extending the grazing season, rotational grazing, all of these things, there's a lot of science behind it, but it's also the art that I think is so important as well. The art part just can't be covered by science. So just getting that experience, learning from each other, dealing with the situations that are thrown at us will really help us be a lot more successful. And as an aside, growing up, I had a lot of bulls called Sanford. Wondered why they were called Sanford, but as I got older, I learned we purchased bulls from Lauren Sanford. So some real great memories of going over to Noble County, learning a lot and trying to become successful. So today, just some thoughts that come to mind. I want to talk a little bit about ways to reduce feeding. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I've talked about that before. I'll talk a little bit about quality. I think this is an interesting year. Maybe I'm more of the exception than the rule, but quality of our hay this year is really pretty good. And I'll talk about some issues with that. I'll talk about some supplemental feed options and then a few other things and anything that you may have as we go along. The one thing that I always like to start off with is this is the time of year now where we do not have a lot of growing forages left. So we have to rely on stockpiled forages, things that we have planted that could be grazed now or stored feed. So this is the most challenging time of the year. These next 90 to 100 days, ways to extend the grazing season. When I talk about management intensive grazing, I'm talking right now about a 100-day rotation, if that's a possibility. So you can kind of take a look. This is the time of year that we really start having some challenges. What are some ways to reduce feeding? Over the years, by far, the cheapest thing to do, if you have that option. Most of us do not, but if you do, if you get over into Western Ohio, Northern Ohio, this is a great option. But harvested cornfields is a great, great option. About 3% of the corn that's harvested never makes it in and through the combine. It falls down to the ground. So if you have a 200 bushel cornfield, you've got 6 bushels of grain sitting right there on the ground. Then they'll feed on the leaves, the cobs, and the stalks. A lot of the combines now will actually grind up the cobs and make it more digestible for our animals. So in the rare situations that you may have that option, that's the best one out there. The next then is stockpiling grasses, and that means making the actual last harvest or grazing or clipping of a field of forages and just let it set aside and grow. Over the years, we've talked about adding 50 pounds of nitrogen to grass, which will definitely increase yields. It can increase quality as well. If you are or do stockpile, I always recommend, if you have that option, to harvest fields that are mixed with legumes first, because legumes will die off pretty quick. Orchard grass next. Orchard grass will stay good. Here in the next couple weeks, it's going to start disappearing. Now, if it gets down to 10 degrees or so, it's just basically going to die back. So we want to graze that orchard grass first, and then, after fields with legumes, and then save stockpiled fescue for last. Stockpiled fescue will keep its quality better than any of the other grasses out there. And the lowest I've ever seen quality wise of fescue, which was unfertilized fescue tested on February 20th, was 6.6% crude protein. So while it's not the best, it's still pretty decent if we do a little supplementation with it. And then there's planting annuals. Annuals, I'm looking at the brassica family, which is primarily turnips, but it could be mustards, kale, rape, things like that. Oats and cereal rye are real good options. The one thing that I've noticed over the past 10 years or so, not only for planting annuals, but also for stockpiled fescue, is how much pressure are you going to get from wildlife? Because that can be a major issue. I've noticed that I lose about a third of my stockpiled fescue that I start grazing in March. I lose it to wildlife. Deer will go out and really, really work on it. And if you're planting annuals like turnips and cereal rye, the deer are just going to be all over it, which is why so many of our deer hunters use those for their plots. Our goal should be to graze all year. These are some pictures I took in the middle of February over in Morgan County. The slide on the left is actually Bob Deest's farm over in Center Township next to Noble County. He also has property in Noble County that he does this with as well. He's actually made it into the middle of February, hadn't fed any of his cattle, anything yet. So, that's our goal. Most of us will not get there, but, that's the one thing we should look forward to. And the bottom line is, if we're feeding stored feeds 150 days out of the year, if we get it cut down to 120, we're making progress. If we get it down to 90 days, we're doing better yet. So, don't act like you have to do it. Just anything that you can do to reduce the amount of days that you have to feed stored feed, you're going to be better off. Because about, up to 3/4 the cost of maintaining a cow or some of our ruminant livestock is in stored feed. Here is just a picture I took Christine and my cattle here back in late October. They're out on some stockpiled grass. This actually, as an aside, is a field that I have most of my buckeye trees in. So for the month of September, I make sure those cows don't get anywhere near it, because I about lost a couple cows in this field. So I waited till late October, turned my cows out on this stockpiled fescue, and you can see that they're in pretty decent shape. They were really responding well to the stockpiled grass. This is that hayfield that I put my cattle on in March. When my spring calving cows are ready to calve, I've got this high and dry field on the farm. I'll put my spring calving cows out on this field in early March, where they'll start having their calves. They'll get on this stockpiled grass, and most years I do not have to feed any more hay after early March. So we can actually extend the grazing season on the other side, on the spring side, and that's what I do a lot. I started doing this about 30 years ago, not because there was any science behind it, but because I was out of hay, and it actually worked really well. Now, if I start feeling guilty for my cows, I may supplement them with a couple pounds of whole shell corn a day. I'll talk about that a little bit more here after a bit. But my cattle, I can actually see their body condition improve in just a couple days once they get out on this stuff. So they really like getting on this stockpiled fescue in March, and they really seem to do good. And then the cows are having calves that are not in the mud. Things are a lot better, high and dry. I have a lot less issues up there. And then here is a field that I started grazing in March. In many years, I have a lot of my hay fields that I'll do some early grazing on. Instead of grazing them in this field for 3 days, maybe only for a day at a time, so they don't pug up the ground if the ground is wet. But sometimes I can graze up to 3 times in these hay fields before I set them aside to let them grow for hay. This accomplishes two things. It reduces the amount of hay that I need to be feeding late in the winter, early spring. And I usually start around 25th of March, give or take a few days. But the key, I think, is to get them off of this before the fescue and orchard grass goes into the boot stage. Once the grass gets into the reproductive stage and starts wanting to produce a stem, I get them off of there. The other advantages is that it sets this hayfield back a couple weeks, and the hay quality is typically quite a bit better by the time I get around to taking this off for hay. And I have a few fields, some of my neighbors' fields that I can't graze. I'll actually take the hay off of those first and let these grow just a little bit more. And at the past 30 years, I think there's been 1 year that I really got bit by it. I made my last grazing in late April, and then we didn't have any rain in the month of May, or very little. And I tried to get hay off there in late May like I should, and I only had about half a crop. So, but most years it ends up doing pretty good. So,
Chris, I have a quick question for
sure,
you, if you don't mind. So,
sure.
in those cases where you're choosing to graze hayfield, do you have water access already in those fields, or do you go to the effort to provide additional water? How do you manage that water component in the hayfield?
In three of the hay fields, Christine, there is not water there, but the adjacent paddock has water. So I will start off with the adjacent paddock, graze it for a day. Then I will open a gate and graze a hay field for a day, then close it where they can get water in that first paddock. And I'll do that with the second hay field, then the third hay field. So it's not the best scenario, but you know, all of us have different situations. And you know, how far do you want to go to make it a perfect situation? I could probably get water into those paddocks if I spent $3,000 or $4,000 to do that. You know, maybe someday I will. But great question, real good question. So for many of us this year, our hay quality is better than normal. Maybe I'm an exception, Christine, but my youngest son, who's been going to college at Wilmington College, majoring in animal science, he went all remote in March, so he was home when hay season started. I always take a trip to Missouri in early to mid-May to go back and see some of my mom's side of the family, and we have a timeshare there. Uh, and I couldn't go there this year. We were working remotely, so our meetings were canceled. So whenever the weather was fit, we started making hay in May, and I was taking vacation and I didn't have to work around meetings and stuff. So we got hay up really quick. And with my son home, we were running 2 tractors at a time. So we got up really good quality hay. We also had those 2 late freezes in April and May that really set our hay fields back. So we got up real good quality hay. The yields were way down this year though. And so I had to fertilize to try to get more for second cutting. So I actually have some real good hay this year. And unlike other years where hay quality is not as good, these animals are, or at least my cattle, are eating that hay like candy. And literally, it's like candy. Last year, we had several reports from ODA from dead cattle that they did autopsies on, and these cows ended up starving to death with full stomachs, which was telling us the hay quality was so bad they couldn't get enough nutrition out of it. Basically, it's like these cows filling up their stomachs with newspaper. And this year, it's like my cows are filling up their stomachs, or not filling it up, with cotton candy. So, so what I'm learning right now is my cows, when we put out some round bales of hay, they will stand around those round bales and just keep eating the stuff, and they're eating it a lot faster than most years. And there is science behind that, because the better the quality, the faster that it'll pass through the animals. Here's an example here, Christine. A week ago, I set out four bales of hay to 35 cows. This was net wrapped hay sitting outside, the worst round bales that I had of the year, because I'm feeding the worst quality hay first. And one day later, you can look at that bale ring and look how well they cleaned up that bale. There's nothing left of it. And what really amazes me is most of the time, the bottom of my hay rings usually will have a bunch of hemp, dogbane, and ironweed in it. And this year, I'm just not seeing any. So, we got on it early, and we just didn't have it nearly as bad. So now I'm in the quandary that I've got cattle eating hay really, really fast, and I may not have enough to make it through the year. So I'm trying to figure out what some of my options are. Here in this scenario, I set up 4 bales of hay, and they basically eat it all in two. And 2 out of the 3 times that I've done this, um, I let them go a day without hay or with very little. They had some in the bottom of the ring still. It was up to where they'd stick their heads through and they could finish it up. The cows were as fat as ticks and they weren't suffering whatsoever, but they were getting more than enough nutrition. So I may stretch it just a little bit that way. We'll see how it goes the rest of the winter. I also do square bales of hay, so I'll be able to limit feed better here when I run out of my round bales. So we need to know what our animals need. I'll go through an example of this here in a minute, but if your hay quality is good and your hay is short, you may need to limit feed a little bit. And again, we got to really walk the fine line with that because I'm very much into making sure our animals don't go hungry. But like I said, on that 3rd day in the morning, they still had a little bit of hay left. I just didn't throw out some more round bales yet. I wanted to make sure they cleaned up what they had, and they just stood around. They looked like fat ticks, Christine, ready to pop. So, um, so you just need to keep that in mind. The other thing that I did one time is when they had most of the hay, the round bales done, I took out a few square bales and gave them. I did that. So, but if your hay quality is not good, or in years where it's not good, you may need to supplement. Um, You'll also want to feed any uncovered hay that's stored outside first, and then feed the stuff inside first. Our worst quality hay we had down along the road in a valley where it doesn't store as good. Our round bales that we'll feed next is up on top of a hill where they can dry out a lot better. And then I'll finish up feeding square bales that are inside of the barn. I've got some first cutting and second cutting of that as well. It's interesting
Yes.
how I decide to do round bales or square bales. If my son is home, I'll tend to do more square bales. If I'm by myself, I tend to do more round bales. So that's how we do it.
I think you're probably going to get into this, yep, here in the next slide. And I was just curious how much of that quality of the bale factor is because of storage rather than harvest time decisions.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Christine. Typically, I think as hay starts deteriorating quality, I think it starts rotting as much as it does losing it. So maybe I'm wrong on that, and that's something that I really haven't seen a lot on. But it's not going to get better. So that's the first certainty we have, and it's going to start rotting, and then we're going to lose it. So, but typically in Ohio, when we store our round bales outside, we'll typically lose 15 to 40%, which is why that I am feeding those round bales first before they lose even more quality. Nutrient losses will exceed uh, dry, dry matter losses. So, Christine, there's kind of your answer there. Protein and energy will be lost. So, real good question. Almost always economically justified to cover bales or store outside. You can get up to a 10-to-1 investment in terms of return on that. Originally, when I thought about people having to build buildings to store the round bales, I thought they were crazy and wasting a lot of money. But over the years, I've seen the economics on it, and especially with Farm Service Agency having low interest loans to for storage facilities, it really has become something that's a very good option for all of us. Here's an example here. If I go out and buy 1,000-pound bale of hay for $120 a ton, and I store it outside, and that outside inch rots, and I lose it, and the cows can't eat it, that turns out being a 6% loss. And that's on a 5-foot by 6-foot bale. So when I lose 6%, actually the edible portion of the hay now is not $120 a ton, it's $128 a ton. Now, if it goes to 3 inches, we're up to almost $150 a ton. 6 inches, it's almost $187 a ton. So suddenly this is getting to be very, very expensive. And again, one thing I always like to compare it against is what is the cost of corn? And I'll talk about this here in a minute, but with corn typically has twice the energy as hay does. So you can replace part of your hay with corn. basically you can replace 1 pound of corn for 2 pounds of hay up to a point, because we still want to make sure they get plenty of hay to keep the rumen working properly. So that's something to keep in your back of mind. I'll touch on that here in a minute. Here's just another slide that talks about how we lose hay depending on how we store it. And this is with alfalfa grouse round bales of hay. You'll kind of see there in the middle, that olive green colored bar. We're losing over a third of the hay, storing it outside on the ground and exposed. And that's what I'm doing with my hay. Now, I'm net wrapping my hay and I'm not losing nearly that much, but I'm still losing some. If we have it on the ground and covered, which is the light colored green, we're down now to under 15%. If it's elevated and exposed, that orange colored one, it's over 25%. But let's look all the way here on the left-hand side. If we have it under roof, it's only 5%. And if we have it in a barn, it's only about 2%. So you can see where it start really paying for itself rather quickly. But losses do occur. We don't see the financial costs, but the costs are really there. One thing that's been becoming much more popular here in Morgan County, and more farmers are adopting this all the time, is putting up baleage or high moisture hay. They're having really good luck with this, having success. There's cost involved with it, time at the time of making the hay, but the ones that are doing it are really sold on it. It lets you put up hay sooner. That's the big thing. You can put it up at 45 to 60% moisture. Let me double check those numbers I just told you on a subsequent slide to make sure I'm saying that right. But the bottom line is you can get hay up sooner. When you get hay up sooner in early May, that's almost definitely going to give you an extra cutting. And not only that, you're putting up quality and you're not putting up junk. So that really helps. One thing that I want to make sure that I explain is you cannot make bad quality hay good quality by making baleage out of it. And some people think they can. The lower quality hay may not properly ferment because there's not enough carbohydrates in that or enough sugar. And if it's too much lignin, it's not going to be able to properly ferment as well. So you want to do this typically with better quality hay. There we go. High moisture hay is ideal at 45 to 60% moisture, so we can confirm that. Dense bales are critical. You got to really get them dense. You need to wrap it at least six times. You need to wrap it tight and keep the air out of it. You want to wrap it the same day. And then when you feed it, you want to try to provide the amount they'll consume quickly. You only want to put out a day or so at a time before it starts rotting. But there's some interesting issues with baleage. Birds like to go on those bales and peck at it. And when you peck at it and expose oxygen to those bales, it'll start rotting it. I've had some reports of some friends telling me there's been bobcats that'll get on top of those so they can scout out fields, and they'll put their claws into it, and then it'll start rotting parts of the bale. If it's not made right or we have some issues, there are some potential livestock issues with this. Listeria or circling disease is one of them. That's when we get into anaerobic conditions with spoiled or moldy, decaying feed if the pH is too high. Botulism's another one. It's more common when dirt is in hay. So if you have, for example, if you have a newly seeded field of hay and you use one of those big V rakes that are kicking up dust when you're raking it, there's going to be a higher chance of having botulism with that. Or if you're taking hay off a field that had flooded recently and all the dirt hasn't washed off the hay. When is the best time to feed poor quality hay? On spring calving cows, the answer is right after weaning. We can let pasture stockpile during that time. Dr. Francis Fluharty, one of our former nutritionists, was really adamant about, what are some other options for poor quality hay. If you have the ability to grind that hay up, it'll increase digestibility 30 to 35% and can increase gains on grass hay by 50 to 100%. And I did ask him one day, I said, is square bales going to be more digestible than the round bales? And he said, definitely so, because it is chopped up, no more than 18 inches long. Grass in a round bale can be 3-4 feet long, which makes it harder for the animals to digest. So some general rules to minimize waste. We want to feed hay in well-drained areas, feed hay in small amounts and or in a feeder. We use the feeders. Our cows will still pull it out and have some waste right by the edges. Then the calves will go lay down in it. But I don't know what else to do. Feed hay in small amounts. We try to limit the amount of feed that we have. I've got to put out enough feeders so all the cows have adequate amount of access to hay. So typically I put out 2 or 3 days at a time, because all of them will have access. Because if I only have out 1 or 2 round bale feeders, the ones at the bottom of the pecking order may not get enough hay, and that can become an issue. Again, feed hay stored outside before we feed it inside. Here's just some estimated losses with hay. If I put hay out without a rack, my square bales, which I do, we may have up to 4% waste. I'm sorry, if we have a rack for them, we may only have 4% waste. Without a rack, just throwing them out on the ground, maybe 6 to 7% waste. The large round bales with a rack, maybe 5%. Without a rack, it goes up to over 12%. And not all racks are created equal. Let me back up here a minute. On that previous slide, that was a 1-day supply of hay. Now on this slide, we go up to a 7-day supply. So if we look at the large round bales with a rack for a 7-day supply, we'll lose 5%. Back on the previous slide, it was only a little bit below 5. So there's not a lot of difference there. Without a rack, it's 12.3% with 1 day. But if I put out a week's worth of round bales without a rack, my losses can go up to, we're approaching 50%. So a lot of it gets wasted. So those racks become really advantageous. Michigan State did a hay feeding study where they wanted to look what type of feeders would work best. The one on the upper left-hand side is one that's called a cone. So it looks like a round bale feeder, but if you look on the inside of it, it's a V-shaped or joist. It's like one of those coffee filters that I use. And, you put that round bale on top of that coffee filter, and then they start working their way through that. And there's a little bit less waste there. The one on the upper right-hand side is more of a traditional type round bale feeder, where we may lose 6% of our hay to that versus that cone one, which was 3.5%. Here's the slide. Here's where it gets interesting. I'm circling all the way back around now where I was talking about digestibility, the good quality hay this year. This slide here shows a real good example that when we start on the bottom left-hand side of this graph, we look at what the forage intake in terms of dry matter per head per day is and comparing it to the digestibility of the hay. If the hay is only 30% digestible, they may only be able to take in 4 pounds of dry matter per day. And this is more in a sheep example. As digestibility goes up all the way to the other side of that chart to 70%, the forage intake can go up to over 10 pounds per day. So it really does jump up in terms of how much they can eat when it becomes more digestible. So that's the issue that I'm having this year. I've got some of the best hay I've ever had, which is a good thing, but they're eating it a whole lot faster and it's passing through a lot faster. This slide here exemplifies what I'm trying to say. How long does hay stay in the rumen? If it's just nice green leaves, it may only stay in the rumen for 24 hours. But if they're eating a bunch of dead stems, let's say I take off some junk hay in late July that has a lot of weeds and a lot of stems in it, it may stay in the rumen for 72 hours. So you can see the difference there in terms of how long it stays in the rumen. So my cows are eating all of this green leaf hay right now, but it only stays in the rumen for 24 hours. They're getting real good quality, but they may think they're hungrier and they're eating a lot more of it. I've shown this slide here for 30 years. If your animals are leaving piles of manure like this, they're not getting good quality hay. There's a lot of lignin in there, which is the reason why those manure piles are the way they are. So when we look at the quality and quantity of hay that we need to feed, we also need to look at what some of our animal requirements are, which includes the age of the animal and the stage of growth, the desired level of production, their reproductive stage. An animal that is in its first trimester of pregnancy is not going to have near the needs as one in the last trimester or one that is under lactation. Breeds and generic variations is going to make a lot of difference too. You have a traditional Hereford type cow that only weighs 1,000 pounds versus a Charolais Simmental cross that may weigh 1,600 pounds. They need a higher percentage of nutrition just to maintain where they're at than something like a Hereford will. Your level of management's another big one too. The environment's a big one. Here's an example here. On a day like this, I'm looking outside of the window. There's snow up in the trees. There's snow on the ground. My cows have a heavy winter coat on them right now. They're actually very, very comfortable. They're not going to start needing additional nutrition until they get down around 19 degrees, although they're getting it because they're eating more than what they need right now, but they're in good shape. They're in good shape. One of the worst situations for our cattle and sheep is if it's 33 degrees outside and it's raining. That when that coat gets wet and it's raining, that's when they're going to need some of the most nutrition, is in a situation like that. Nutrient priorities, it's always going to be maintenance first, development next, then growth, lactation, reproduction, and fattening. So we need to keep those in mind, that our animals, our cows in March when they're nursing, when you have baby calves on them nursing, it's not going to provide enough milk for the calf if the cow's maintenance issues aren't being met. So we need to make sure that we're getting our animals the right nutrition based on where they're at and what we're trying to accomplish with them. That's a pretty good looking steak there, Christine. And then, what are the nutrients needed by our livestock? The nutrients that our animals need the most are the ones that are most lacking. I was always told that. And it could be something as simple as a micronutrient that's only needed in a few parts per million. But as I tell our 4-H and FFA kids, when they're going through quality assurance, what is the nutrient that's needed the most? It's going to be water. That's the most important one. Energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins are the other nutrients that our animals need. So just kind of wanted to touch on that. And typically with hay, we're going to be looking at, what are the energy and crude protein needs for our cattle. I'm just going to go through an example here and try to explain, is your animal going to need more energy or more protein or some type of supplement? In this example, just to make it simple, I'm going to look at the crude protein needs. If you haven't sampled your hay, and I encourage you to do it, we do have some charts. Christine can get them for you. I can, but it's by far best to get some testing done so we know what our animals need. But I'm going to go through an example here to just help you out and help you understand how easy it is to really figure things out. But when I went looking into my nutrient requirements for beef cows, it's not going to show up here, is it, Christine? I've got this publication on nutrient requirements for beef cows. It's got the tables listed of all the things that our animals need. I looked at a 1,200 pound late gestation cow, because we're getting close to that scenario here today in mid to late December. I'm going to use an example with orchard grass. A late bloom orchard grass will have in the range of 8.4% crude protein. 1,200 pound late gestation cow needs 7.8% crude protein. So what it's telling me right now is if our cows have plenty of this hay, it's going to meet the crude protein nutritional needs for that cow. She also needs, in that table, it also tells me that a 1,200-pound late gestation cow needs 1.75 pounds per day of crude protein. So if I take my 1.75 pounds times that 8.4% crude protein in that late bloom orchard grass, it's going to tell me that she needs 21 pounds of that hay per day. Typically speaking, we like to give our animals about 2% of their body weight a day in hay, but she needs a minimum of 21. And if I'm giving her 2% per day, that's 24 pounds. It's going to meet and exceed the nutritional needs of my cow. But many years hay quality is worth. Um, so, it's not only crude protein, but energy. More years than not, it turns out being energy. But if you're too low in energy or crude protein, um, you may need to supplement. Corn is a great energy substitute. Protein may also be needed as well. So let's talk a minute about if we need protein. A lot of my clientele use protein tubs. Um, I'm not one that's ever used it. Typically speaking, energy is the biggest issue, and if my protein levels are low, corn typically has 8%, so that's going to meet the needs of some of my animals too, and it provides a lot of energy. But if you want to use a protein tub, you need to look and see if they're natural or urea based. I'm not the best at this, Christine, but I know that urea based protein tubs can have issues. Most of the times they don't, but I just want to preface that there could be some issues. Um, these are best. The urea based protein tubs are best for high energy diets, not typically speaking poor quality hay diets. And we don't want it for calves under 120 days of age or less than 400 pounds. There is some toxicity potential there. So my point is, it's just understand it before you use it. I'm not saying don't use urea based. I think there are some great scenarios where it can be used, but I just want to make sure you understand it before you use it. I'm a big proponent of some of the natural based stuff. I've in the past, when I've had low protein, I've actually used some soybean meal. I remember Lauren Sanford telling me 35 years ago that salt is one thing that can limit the amount of intake of feed. And we actually had a mineral recommendation that we put in 50 pounds of soybean meal per 50 pounds of salt, and that would limit the amount of soybean meal that they would consume a day, but then that would help meet their protein needs. Okay. Um, so, is alfalfa an option? Do you have some good second cutting hay that you could use as a substitute? Um, my point is here is I try to save the best hay for the last 60 days of gestation. I'm thinking about 70% of calf development happens in that last 60 days. So that's when we really want to make sure that we save the best hay for the last 60 days. Do you need energy? The most common, that tends to be the most common need. As I mentioned, corn's a good option. When I feed it out in the fields, I typically feed it right on the ground. So I feed whole shell corn and they clean it right up. If you have the ability to feed in some type of tubs or something like that, I've had friends that use plastic barrels, cut them in half. That works really good. But if you have a place off the ground to feed your animals and you're going to give them some corn, if you can break that kernel into 3 to 4 pieces, that's where you're typically going to see the maximum digestion from that corn. You still have decent digestion with whole shell corn, but if you can cut it or break it up into 3 to 4 pieces, that works best in terms of digestibility. So a corn example here, I mentioned this earlier. Corn typically has about twice the energy of hay. So if a cow's needing 24 pounds of hay, 20 pounds of hay a day, you then could substitute 10 pounds of hay for 5 pounds of corn. And in this situation here, you could give your cattle 5 pounds of corn a day and 10 pounds of hay. In some of my scenarios where I've been short on hay, I would always go up and take my cattle up a 50-pound bag of corn and feed 2 pounds less of square bales of hay, which typically weigh a little bit less than 50 pounds. I notice as I get older, Christine, my square bales get lighter. They're now more towards 40 pounds. Again, I want to make sure that I emphasize that you want to try to keep feeding some hay to keep that rumen functioning properly. Again, this will allow you to stretch out some hay supplies and or improve overall feed quality. I do have some thoughts on minerals. I've seen a lot of farmers over the year only feed the salt blocks. They may feed the trace mineral salt blocks, and that's fine. I just want you to understand what they're getting. They're getting salt and trace minerals. Trace minerals are those micro minerals like copper, cobalt, iron, iodine, molybdenum, manganese, zinc, and selenium. These are all ones that are only needed in a few parts per million. They're still needed, don't get me wrong, they are. But in that salt block and even in a loose mineral, it's only a few parts per million. Then there's the macronutrients. Salt, of course, is one of them, but the other ones are calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium. Potassium is rarely needed. Maybe if we're feeding stockpiled forages in mid to late winter, fescue's been shown to leach a little bit of potassium. I could see a scenario where that may be needed, but it's very rare. But calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium are bigger ones. Now, here's the secret. When you go buy mineral, there's a real direct correlation with the cost of it and how much phosphorus and magnesium is in it. Calcium is ground limestone, it's cheap. Salt is salt, it's cheap. Phosphorus and magnesium is expensive. So when you buy cheap loose mineral, that's why it's cheap, because it doesn't have much phosphorus or magnesium in it. It probably has a lot of salt and calcium. Ideally, we want to have calcium to phosphorus. We want to have a ratio of a 2-to-1, 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus. That's where we want to really help reproduction and growth on our animals. That's where it's going to be maximized. Typically, it can be in the 1.1 to 6.1 range. 2-to-1's ideal. Magnesium is a mineral that we really want to have, especially in the spring, to avoid grass tetany. I tend to feed it all year round just because it's simple to do. But typically, when grass tetany could be a problem, we want at least 10% of it in our mineral ration. I feed this ration, that's a 12-4-14 ration, which means it's 12% calcium, 4% phosphorus, 14% magnesium. That's typically what I do. And it also has the trace minerals in it as well. So when you're looking at minerals, just keep that in mind. Look at that calcium to phosphorus ratio. You want to have some phosphorus in your mineral ration. And magnesium, I feed it year round, but typically you want to be more conscious of it in the spring months. And it could be in the late summer, early fall, when the legumes are cutting back and the grass is growing fast. But when the grass is growing very fast, or you have predominantly grass, that's when your magnesium levels will need to go up, because there's a lot more magnesium in the legumes. So early spring, the grass typically grows before the legumes, and that's why we could have a magnesium issue. Just some final reminders. It's important to know what our animals' needs are and to know the quality of the hay. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of testing our hay, but have an idea where it's at, and then we can make some adjustments if we need to. Animal harvest feed is typically going to be much cheaper than stored feed. So the less days we have to go outside and feed hay, the better off we're going to be. Christine, don't tell your husband Keegan this. That is a tractor mechanic. Every day that I don't have to drive my tractor is a day that I'm saving money, because whenever I get on it, it's costing me money. Feed hay stored outside first, minimize waste. And finally, supplemental feed may be needed. Corn's usually a good option. So speaking of that, it's not even winter yet, and I can't wait for spring. This is my spring calving cattle back last March, late March, their calving season starting. Well, it's actually in early April. I can see a tree starting to leaf out, and that's the community goat. That's a 4-H project that went wrong with some of the neighbors. Any questions for me?
Chris, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I know I jotted down a few things, a few quotes to use in future programs. And I had a question for you, and then it just escaped me. Um, it was pertaining to that high mag mineral. That's what I was thinking. And you had mentioned that you feed the high mag mineral all year round. I know some producers around here that do the same thing. And is that primarily just out of habit, so you don't have to change your mineral partway through the year?
Honestly, yes. Yes. I mean, to be totally transparent, I buy from a local person. He buys it a pallet at a time. And it takes me 6 months. Basically I can go all year on that pallet of minerals. So yeah, if I had my choice of 20 different minerals in the winter months, I would cut back to a lower protein, to a lower magnesium mineral without question. In the summer months now we
Now,
use, go on.
can you get high mag mineral also with the fly control in the same mix?
Yes, we were able to do that. The company that we used didn't make it till I brought it up because the mineral that has the insect growth regulator in it, methoprene, uh, we need to be using that before our cows start laying eggs. I mean, not before our cows, before the flies start laying eggs in the manure. So we need to be feeding that stuff in March, and that's the time we need to use the high magnesium. So the company, I actually called the people at the company out of state about it, and they started making it. So yeah, it can be done, but that's a great point because there is an overlap in March and April where we need high magnesium mineral, but also with the insect growth regulator in it.
Great, thank you. And Tammy Otto is on, and Tammy works at Heritage here in Caldwell. And Tammy, that might be something to discuss in the future if you have customers that may ask as a result of this conversation, or if you have a product in stock that has both the high magnesium content and the fly control insect growth regulator in it. Yeah,
I
as
believe,
Chris said, there's certainly a time where that's beneficial.
I think they do. They have a real good product line there too.
Okay, well, if there aren't any additional questions, Chris, thank you for joining us today. Before we depart, I do want to share screen and share one of our upcoming events this winter. I do see Tammy typed in the chat. We do carry several varieties.
They have a real good
So
product line,
thank you.
without question.
I'm going to share screen here just to show you the flyer for an upcoming event. We have been working really hard on creating a online curriculum for our Pastures for Profit program, and we will be releasing the details of this program hopefully this afternoon. So keep an eye out for the details of this class. We will have an online curriculum class that also goes along with 3 webinars, and the webinars will be offered January 13th, February 3rd, and March 3rd, all at 7 p.m. and on Zoom. This course does have a fee, and the fee covers the other course materials that you would receive in the mail as a part of your registration. So we will be pushing this out in the coming weeks leading up to January 13th. Registration will be open up to the first day of the class. And once you're registered, you'll have access to the entire set of materials that go along with Pastures for Profit. So we hope you'll consider joining us for that program this winter. And so we'll stop our recording for today and hope to see you all next month for our next virtual Farm Talk breakfast. To save the date, the 3rd Friday of January is January 15th. So we'll probably do some type of a topic to help relieve some cabin fever and get you through the rest of winter. And we will keep you posted on what that topic is. Again, thank you, Chris, and thank you to all our attendees who joined us this morning.